So first of all, thanks very much for joining us today. And yes, Chris, I must apologise for downgrading you to a doctor from a professor. So that was my mistake. So it's nice that Alison's put that right. So no doubt. Yes, thank you, Chris. So let's start. Obviously, Alison's given a brief introduction about myself. I've been at Loddington for over 25 plus years as working farm manager up to my title now, Head of Farming Training and Partnerships. And I've worked for a lot of that time with Chris as well. So we're going to take you through really the last 25 plus years of work at Loddington, and hopefully we can excite you, enthuse you about the work we've been doing. So let's start about some of the big picture stuff and some of the challenges that might have been affecting our work or affect our work in the future. And really climate and temperature, with all the other things that are going on short term. Really, if you look at this graph here, it's the red bar in the 2010s onwards that are ones for causing concern here. And these are the high temperature records. A few low temperature records as well in the UK, it is fair to say, but if you look going back through the decades there, you'll see the changes to an increasing UK temperature, and this is being followed, rather mirroring what's happening in the world as well. So if we look at, if we can look at moving that on a bit. Yeah, so if we look at the next challenge, which is associated to climate as well, and if we look more recently about weather patterns in this area, and the dark blue is the really area I want to concentrate on, probably just a bit north of our region, but I think many of you who have witnessed the rainfall of the last 12 months would probably think that it's been anything but average. It just shows you that in some places our rainfall has been extremely high in the last 12 months. And and these things have swings from high temperatures to high rainfall to extremes seem to be occurring more frequently. However, I must say that really as a farmer, if the weather's not there to talk about and to converse with, then it's probably a pretty dull day. So I think farmers are used to actually talking very much around the subject of weather. But that's our second challenge, as it were. And of course, associated with high temperatures and associated with climate as well is net zero and greenhouse gases. And the amount of carbon dioxide, perhaps the amount of ammonia and methane is a subject as well, which I probably won't go into. Chris might touch on it a bit later on in some of the research. But what are we going to do and how are we going to address net zero, about efficiency, about storing carbon in hedgerows, in soil? What's our bioenergy, our renewable sector like? And these are challenges that we're going to have to address and face, and hopefully be able to bring down that carbon dioxide content from our environment. And one of the other challenges that we might talk about, this picture was taken, I think, from about 2014-15. And this is about the amount of soil that's actually left the United Kingdom. And you can see some of our estuaries from the Severn to the Thames, where soil is leaving soils after the high rainfall periods. And really, this is our shop floor, and we want to keep this in the fields. So how are we going to address those challenges around soil? And there's a couple of books here which give a good insight, and I know a number of you may well have read these books by David Montgomery. The first one, Dirt, The Erosion of Civilization, about perhaps some case studies from history from centuries and centuries ago, and some from the last century, and some that we might face in the future, about if we don't look after our soil, if we don't keep it covered, if we don't try and enhance and protect, then we may well, history has taught us a few lessons. And of course, a much brighter picture is David Montgomery's book, Growing for Revolution, which is much more positive about bringing our soil back to life. And hopefully some of the stuff we'll be talking about tonight will actually expand on that. And he's called it Growing for a Revolution, about how we can put life back into our soil. And as a farmer, I would like to think that what we've been doing here for 20 years, we're building on a lot of good work that farmers have done in the past. So, in amongst the talk of temperature, in amongst the talk of climate, rainfall, net zero greenhouse gases, we shouldn't forget about biodiversity as well, whether it be insects or farmland birds or mammals. then that biodiversity, that flora and fauna in our countryside is really important. So I think it's many things make up that environment, and I think many things need to be considered as we talk about those challenges that face us. So there are a few post-Brexit opportunities, and I'll just mention this briefly. I won't get too much heavy into the talk of 25-year environment plans, maybe a couple of slides perhaps. But the other challenge we do face is what's going to happen after we leave. So we have a 25-year environment plan, which is really setting the aims and aspirations of DEFRA with a consultation. And then on the far right of your screen there is going to be some of the legislation, the agriculture bill, the environment bill, which will give us the building blocks on which to move into this new era. So there will be some challenges associated with Brexit, associated with trade, associated with us leaving the European Union, which we will look at a little bit in a bit more detail later on, but we won't be going too heavy into that. But that document, the Green Future 25-year environment plan, is very much about our future aspirations for our environment. And I'd like to think that some of that work that's in that document is some of the stuff that we've been practicing, researching for our previous 25 years. So hopefully we're in a good place to expand on some of the DEFRA thinking. So of course the language of government is, and these will be familiar to a number of you, clean air, plentiful water, thriving plants, a reduced risk of harm from environmental hazards, using resources from nature more sustainably. And perhaps the one that's new to a lot of farmers is enhanced beauty, heritage, engagement with the natural environment. I heard someone the other day calling this valuing the vista. So I think that's a good area of change and opportunity for farmers in the future. And of course, we will hear terminology such as about food being an ecosystem service and not a public good. And we'll also see information in this plan as well on developing and restoring healthy soil. So within the 25-year environment plan, healthy soil and restoring vulnerable peatlands was perhaps, it wasn't much expanded on, but I think as we've gone through the agriculture bill, as we're going through ELMS, I think soil has got much more importance, and DEFRA realised that it's really the shop floor on which a lot of our businesses are built on. So there's competition in the countryside for all these things, for food production systems and the natural capital and this 25-year environment plan. And really finding that balance is what we're going to talk about for the rest of the evening. And hopefully that's set some of the big picture stuff. And now what we're going to look at is specifically Allerton Project. So striking that balance between food production, so whether it be cultivating healthy soils or the sustainable intensification platform, or conservation agriculture, and I'll expand on that a little bit later, or the balance of soil and water. These are all things that we've been involved with over the last 25 years and have engaged with various industry stakeholders, various organizations to find what are the tipping points, what's the balance, how can we find those win-wins. And really, the document that I've based this talk on is really our 25-year Fields to the Future, a winning blueprint, probably self-titled, but a winning blueprint for the future. And it really does summarize what work we've been doing over the last 25 years. It falls into about 7 categories: the Allerton Objectives, food and farm business, boosting biodiversity, soil, water and farming, our research, which I'm going to hand over to Professor Stoate, and catchment management, landscape scale conservation. And finally, one thing which is often missing from a lot of people's discussion is there's a lot about farm business and food and perhaps profitability and productivity in there, and there's a lot about environment. But actually people make this happen. So making sure that you have a strong community engagement and you invest in your people is really important as well. So they're the areas. Let's move on. So first, the Allerton Project. arrow here, if we look at, if you're familiar with Uppingham, we're just 4 miles west of Uppingham, so just inside Leicestershire, bordering with Rutland. It's probably about 35 minutes from Peterborough. We are the catchment is really the Eye Brook, feeds into the Eye Brook, which is a reservoir just by Corby, which is down in the bottom there in the blue. And our farm sits in the middle of the catchment, really. And towards the top end of the catchment is grassland and then mainly arable. But Chris will talk a bit more about catchment in some of the future slides. So the Allerton Objectives, 3 objectives. First one is to combine productive farming with wildlife conservation. And these objectives haven't really changed since 1992. So second one is to research the interaction between farming, wildlife conservation, resource management, and the environment. So the interactions between the two, the balance between farming, sustainable food production, and wildlife conservation, resource management, protection. And then to disseminate, to share those results for the benefit of farmers, policymakers, and others. And very much, you know, part of what we're doing tonight is about sharing our work and discussing it with other people. So now's the time when the food and the farm business come in. I put this right at the top because in amongst a lot of the other slides that we'll show tonight, there will be a lot about environment, biodiversity, soil, but food is fundamental here. The word agriculture and the word farmer usually mean that somewhere on the line we're going to be producing food. And in order to do so, we need to have a productive landscape. We also need to have a profitable landscape. So the caveats on the rest of this production, of this presentation are, food is core to this business. So all the things that you'll be aware of in your own business, from risk management, diversification, business planning, getting the maximum efficiencies out of your machinery, and the opportunities are all things we're talking about. And of course, as we move into new scenarios, we're looking at new approaches as well. So just a word historically about our patchwork of cropping and the layout is we had much mixed crops around there, from winter wheat, which is the orange colour, spring beans, oats, even in this year a little bit of hemp and fibre in a project we were doing. And then if we move forward now to where we are as the farm business, we're in a joint venture with our neighbour. We've consolidated our cropping a little bit. This 2019 harvest, once again, you'll see the wheat is more consolidated. We have winter barley now, and we have a number of other crops. And if I take your attention to the tables now, you can see our historic rotation, quite short, with 4 crops or 5 crops in it, but 4 places in the rotation, to our current rotation, where we're looking at winter wheat, winter barley, oilseed rape, another wheat, winter or spring beans, winter wheat, and winter or spring oats. Now, of course, some of that is planned, and as we will talk about the weather in 2020 in a bit, some of it is unplanned and our hand has been forced. But more interestingly, down the left-hand side is where we're growing things like companion crops with oilseed rape, catch crops before winter wheat, and cover crops before spring beans, and cover crops before spring oats. So that just shows you how our rotation has expanded. So let's put a little bit more gloss on the 2020 season. It seems to be the season that just keeps giving. Well, gloss, actually, I'm not sure there is much gloss, as we have done very little combining at the moment. Last week, when things were just about fit to go, we did do a couple of days, struggled through some oats with the straw churning away in the combine, and now we sit with wet weather. But then again, that's a farmer going off into a discussion about the weather, so let's move on. So if I look at our cropping for this year, and you'll see there some winter beans, you'll see most of the other crops in there are all spring crops. So that is a result of the 2020 the 2019 weather in the back end, where it seemed to rain continuously for most of October, November, December, and January. Just to have a look at some of this, is a drone shot taken in May with a few skylark plots in the first field. That's a field of spring wheat. We've got some spring barley and spring oats there, and that just gives you a panorama of some of the crops. And 85% of our crops this year were spring crops. So we look as well at some spring wheat here. This is in one of our conservation agriculture trials that we're doing. And you'll see on the right-hand side is our plough, in the middle is min-till, and on the left-hand side is a light till. And I'll describe more of those in the next few slides. So before Chris talks in depth about some of our research work, I'm just going to have a couple of slides on some of a big project we're doing with Syngenta on conservation agriculture, and just put up some headline figures on 2 or 3 slides of these. So basically, these are a sustainable farming system, which is a light till basically, so virtually direct drilling, a min-till system with maybe one deep time cultivation then drill, and what we might consider a plough-based system with conventional ploughing. And this is a field of beans from this year, spring beans. And really, I just wanted to look at 2 areas of this graph. So this is the gross margin from last season, and plough system, which is the dark blue one, still giving us the best returns. And actually in the seasons before, it was even more exaggerated. But if I move to the second graph here, where we're now taking off the cultivation cost, we're beginning to see a much more evening up, because it's cost us less to actually cultivate before we sow the crop. So we're saving some money there. Where this system comes into its own, and this system here, which is the light direct drill one, comes into its own, is when we start putting savings in machinery costs. So probably in this system here, the sustainable min-till system, we've probably got 1 cultivator less. And on this light till system, we've probably got a tractor and a cultivator less. So with some real savings here that begin, and if you spread that over the 5 years of the rotation, we're beginning to see a change in the gross margin, not necessarily yield, but the gross margin and the margin of these crops. So if I move on to environment sustainability, and we talk about earthworm counts and gas emissions, and once again, I'm going to skip quite quickly over gas emissions. But once again, we've got our 3 systems: plough, min-till, light till, and we've got earthworm numbers. So let's bring in the underground engineers. So we've got our blue, which is our plough system, min-till system, and then light till system. And I would have thought that actually min-till would have been higher, but our research in the first year showed that the sustainable system, so this min-till system, had more earthworms. But in year 2, look how the drop there. And you think, well, what are we doing wrong here? Well, actually, this season here, 2019, was incredibly dry. And we think that's mainly most of the reason for the drop in earthworm numbers. But the trend here, and the trend here is still the same. Moving on to greenhouse gas emissions, I'll just mention that we tended to find, as you would expect, more greenhouse or more carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent from nitrous oxide, methane, and CO2 in the plough-based system. And perhaps Chris might expand on that a little bit in his slides. So this whole Syngenta project really is looking at the sustainability of the system, its riskiness, its agronomy, field operations, productivity, how complex is it, and quite important to me is how profitable is it to me as a farmer. And just some of our headlines in our first 3 years are reduction in greenhouse gases, 50%, 81% increase in earthworms, a reduction in cultivation costs, 43 times more farmland birds, reduction in fuel use, and an increase in work rate per hectare. So that just gives you a small taste of a current agricultural farming conservation project we're doing at Allerton. So I just briefly mention about some temporary grass and clover Leys that we've been putting in over the last few years, and some herbal Leys, and I might expand on them in a bit in a few slides' time. If I turn now to a little bit about livestock and agroecology, so I have some traditional Leicester longwolves, and we've just invested in a small flock of Rylands as well, probably because they're not as tall and don't eat the trees as much, so they can't get up as high, but we'll see how that we get on with those. And our agroforestry project has been in for 4 or 5 years now, and it's just beginning to look like there's some trees in the field. A little bit about framing our fields, and this year, because of a lot of headlands that were very wet from last autumn, we've spent a bit of time in actually establishing green headlands and summer legume mixes. And you'll see here's a time slot of these fields as they progress to what they look like. This is probably 3 weeks ago. So around most of our fields, we've been putting in a green headland mix, and we've been putting in a summer legume mix as well. And really this fits quite nicely into one of the sections of the work we've been doing over about boosting biodiversity. So what crops can we grow for birds? What can we do for managing marginal land, which is, I would count as also the bit that we compact around our margins and headlands? What can we grow for wild bird seed crops? And how do we encourage insects? So that's been very much part of our work over the last 25 years. And framing our fields is probably one of the ways that we will be doing that in the past, and we'll be doing it in the future. So just a few pictures which I'll just go through, and you'll see, once again, this is our rolling landscape here. This is a traditional hay meadow here. Probably this was taken probably 3 or 4, probably a month or 6 weeks actually before we cut it. And you'll see these margins, green headland mixes around the edges of our field with our crop in the middle, bit of drainage work going on there from the winter. And you'll see now this is one of our wildflower mixes that was taken about a fortnight ago, which has got perennial rye, phacelia in it, and a few other things in there as well. But it's been a fantastic year for, even though it was too dry, the rain of recent weeks has meant that a lot of our margins have flourished. And I'll just take you through 1 or 2 of those. So sunflowers and wild, so this has got some lucerne in it as well, and some chicory and some other things. And this is taken just 2 or 3 days ago. In fact, probably the end of last week. Once again, I'll move on to some summer legume mixes that are around our fields, and they really do look spectacular this year. And this is one of the green headland mixes, once again taken about a fortnight ago. And this is on land which traditionally you can just see the part of the crop here which is quite thin, and if we were to grow this crop into this part of the field, it's a very poor piece of soil, very high in clay content, quite poorly drained, but it seems to be flourishing this year with some of our green headland mixes. But we should also not forget that it isn't just about planting just wildflowers. You know, some of our traditional hay meadows and some traditional grasslands, so this is in our agroforestry project actually, in a bit that hasn't been grazed, you know, timothy in full flower, it's very attractive for certain butterflies and certain insects. So, and we've got down on the bottom left there, we have a sanctuary mix, which is full of wild full of gnatweed and full of teasels, and that has some real good benefits for farmland birds, for shelter and protection, and also for pollinators and crop pest predators. I'll admit there are a few crop pests that harbour in there, but I'm hoping that I'm helping the good guys in there. And then finally, the last one is a clover mix, so a more pollen nectar mix. So let's not forget about other habitats, rather than just maybe some of the more flowering and visually aesthetic ones. So just a quick word here about soil, water and farming, and some of our policies around regenerative farming. So regenerative farming, or our view, there's many views on regenerative farming. We haven't got time to go into them today, but this is probably our look at them. Is firstly, we're building on conservation agriculture. So we're building on these pillars of reduced tillage, wide rotation, continuous soil cover. And to that, we're adding livestock and a system shift. Within the livestock, I might say as well that I would include grass in that, and you may well say that actually you could have grass and not have the livestock. So if you're in a region that hasn't got the infrastructure of water or buildings, you might just fertility build using some of the agri-environment schemes to help put grass in your system, and fertility build help you with some of your grassweed problems as well in the future. So I would say that there's a good paper here on regenerative farming written by Lacan and Lundgren in 2018, and I really would recommend that as a regenerative agriculture, emerging farming and natural resource conservation. It's written from the States, but lots of the headlines in there are going to be very applicable to us in the United Kingdom in the next few years. So I'm not going to spend too much time on soil, water and farming, only that that's my aim and aspiration, to get a soil that has consistently across the farm earthworms, air, roots in there, organic matter, and much of the research we've done in the past has been around trying to establish how we look after our soil, how we how we make it get to that stage with cover crops and how we protect our water as well. So, Chris, I'm going to hand over to you now, and Professor Stoate, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Phil. So I'm going to provide a bit of an overview of the research we've been doing over the last 27 years or whatever it is now. There's obviously not a chance to go into a lot of detail about results in the time available, but I'm keen to give you a bit of an idea of the range of research that we've been doing as listed here. Okay, Phil. Phil?
You want me to go on one, sorry?
Yep. So starting with farmland ecology, we've done a lot of research on farmland ecology, mainly in the early years, but that's been continuing. So just as a few examples here, whitethroats, that's the migratory warbler, very much associated with farmland in temperate Europe, and within farmland very much associated with herbaceous vegetation in the base of hedges. So thinking back to '92 when the project started, they didn't really exist. In the '90s, we carried out this research, which showed that there was a direct relationship between the number of whitethroats in any given field boundary and the amount of this grassy or herbaceous vegetation. And yellowhammers, another species, which is familiar to most of us, also using this habitat, also associated with that habitat. And its nesting success is actually influenced by which habitat it chooses to nest in, whether it's nesting in the grassy vegetation or whether it's nesting in the hedge. And so much higher nesting success for nests in grassy vegetation. So that's probably the driver for why whitethroats are selecting that habitat. We've also carried out research on pollinating insects, mainly in relation to hedgerow fruit sets, so looking at blackthorn, hawthorn, for example. How important are pollinators to fruit set in those species, and others we've looked at as well. And certainly for hawthorn, the more solitary bees occur in a field boundary or hedgerow length, the more hawthorn berries there are at this time of year. And the correlation continues into the winter as well, because the more hawthorn berries there are, research showed the more migratory thrushes there are. So you have this link between the numbers of solitary bees present. We hear a lot about bumblebees, but don't forget the solitary bees, there are many more of them. You have this relationship between the number of solitary bees in the length of the hedge in the summer and the number of birds present in the hedge in the winter. So that's just a very brief example of some of the work we've been doing specifically on farmland ecology. We've also looked at yellowhammers and crop diversity. That's an important point to make, is that yellowhammers forage in different habitats or different crops at different points in the breeding season. So the greater the diversity of habitats that they have available to them within their foraging range, the better able they are to forage to find food for nestlings. Okay. Phil? A lot of our research led on to the development of what are often familiar agri-environment scheme options, and I've mentioned just a little bit on the work we did on grass margins. We continued the research that GWCT had carried out at Fordingbridge on beetle banks, continued that research at Loddington, looking at the rates of establishment of different grasses and the rates of colonisation by beneficial predatory invertebrates, and their impact on aphids in the crop as well. So all that's helped to inform the development of future agri-environment schemes. And the wild birdseed mixture is a classic. It's of course adopted on so many farms now, and that was developed as an agri-environment scheme through a DEFRA contract carried out at Loddington. Okay, Phil. So wild birdseed mixtures, one of the reasons they're so popular is that they fit into the game management system so well, of course, providing game crops as well as habitats for wildlife. And there's we managed the farm at Loddington as a small shoot, but we've changed the management over the years and looked at non-game species, looked at changes in abundance of non-game species, but primarily the songbirds. And this graph shows from our baseline year in 1992, in which we didn't change anything, it shows the increase in songbird numbers in response to the game management system, and then a subsequent decline when we stopped that game management. This was the game management system concentrating on wild game birds. And then subsequently, over the past decade, introducing a game management system that's more akin to a reared game bird shoot. And there again, thank you, Phil, seeing an increase in songbird numbers again. So that's the sort of long-term monitoring that we're able to do by being an established project at Loddington. But within that, we fit in shorter scale, normally 3-year research projects. And that's what I want to talk to you about this evening. Okay, Phil. So in terms of wildlife, what's that got to do with climate change? Well, not much perhaps, except that a lot of species are affected by climate change negatively, in the example that Phil gave earlier, with the very hot, dry conditions in soil affecting earthworm numbers and activity. Those conditions affect soil biological activity much more widely than just earthworms. But there are also some benefits. Some invertebrates, for example, some of the grasshoppers and crickets benefit from climate change, and we're seeing colonisation of the farm by some of those species. And again, that's where the long-term observations come in. So Phil talked about a conservation agriculture project with Syngenta. That's looking at the whole system over 5 fields over a 5-year period. We've also looked at specific aspects of those systems. So we've looked in particular at many projects looking at the comparing plough-based system with direct drilling or reduced cultivation, looking at impacts on soil properties, and specifically one project looking at tramline management, accepting that tramlines are often an important pathway, the major pathway, runoff from arable fields to the field edge and sometimes to watercourses, and that we're likely to see increased frequency of intense storm events. We need to understand how to manage our tramlines better in order to reduce soil loss and to reduce our impact on water. So that was one project that enabled us to do just that. And cover crops as well. Through a DEFRA contract, we've been able to look at how cover crops can fit into our farming system. It's fairly well established that they have benefits in terms of reducing nutrient and soil loss to water. But we wanted to know a bit more detail about how they fitted in with our farming system and what the other benefits, if any, might be, and indeed what the shortfalls might be as well. And certainly in our clay soils in the west of the East Midlands region, we do have some, up in the hills here, we do have some challenges in establishing cover crops, it has to be said. So certainly something that we need to know more about, something that we need to understand before we jump in there and adopt them too widely. And that's where our research comes in. Okay, Phil. And I've mentioned soil biology. Soil biology is absolutely crucial to soil function, whether that's function in terms of nutrient cycling or in terms of soil structure that will benefit cropping, or whether it's in terms of carbon sequestration and soil storage, or whether it's in terms of infiltration, water infiltration rates, which have public benefits. So increased organic matter, improved water infiltration rates will have some benefits for the cropping, and they'll have some benefits in terms of ecosystem services, in terms of water quality, in terms of flood risk management. So in many of these projects, we're monitoring, often in quite some detail, a whole range of things simultaneously. So a whole range of changes in response to just one change in management. And the bottom left photograph there is an experimental setup for the Soil Biology and Soil Health Project, which is an AHDB contract that's looking at a whole range of biological metrics from the earthworms that Phil mentioned earlier on, through small soil invertebrates, which have an important role in soil function and nutrient cycling, through to the soil microbiology as well, using environmental DNA to look at various aspects of soil biology, microbiology. Okay, Phil? And a lot of our research is experimental, it's rigorous experimental design, but often it's informed by farmers. Quite often farmers are taking part in it. And so we're involving farmers around Loddington and sometimes from further afield in guiding our research. And then we're using, as we've referred to previously, we're using the results of that research, of course, to inform policy, so that meets the requirements of farmers while also delivering some of the benefits that were expected, so the public benefits we're expected to deliver as well. So it's a great system of having that farmer input into the research we do, doing that research on a practical farm, and then sharing that research with policymakers and, of course, more widely. And key to our academic credibility, which is what's important, especially in terms of influencing policymakers, is the publication of scientific journal papers. And so that's a key aspect of our work. We've published well over 100 scientific papers during the course of the project, and that enables us to get the research results out to the scientific community and to policymakers, and simultaneously we're sharing the results of our research through visits to Loddington with farmers and others, and through webinars such as this. Okay. Well, so moving on to some of our most recent work, Phil referred to the greenhouse gas emission work we're doing. We've been looking specifically at using plough or subsoiling to reduce compaction in direct drilled field, and what are the implications of that for greenhouse gas emissions from the soil. And we've been doing this throughout the year. Phil showed that great result of 50% reduction in greenhouse gases. That's for the monitor period in that project, which is mainly through the summer. We see it's not quite so positive for the whole year, but when you consider nitrous oxide emissions during the winter and early spring period, but nevertheless, it's quite clear that there's a net benefit from direct drilling in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, even in this deliberately compacted situation. And then Phil mentioned the conservation agriculture project, which, as I say, is a whole system approach, where we're not so much teasing out the influences on individual management practices, but looking at the effect of the whole system. And then the red meat sector gets a lot of stick for methane emissions, and of course we have DEFRA's Code of Good Practice for reducing ammonia, which is largely associated with manure storage and handling. There's some massive challenges there, and we need to be using manure, and there are limits to what we can do in terms of reducing ammonia emissions from it, but we can look at other aspects of work that we might do. And so very recently we've been trying to understand ammonia emissions from sheep urine patches, as there is some scope for modifying ammonia emissions from ruminant urine by modifying the diet. Okay, Phil. So ammonia, obviously not a greenhouse gas, but an important one to understand in terms of air quality. So most of our work over the years has been on arable systems and agri-environment scheme options that have been developed for arable systems. But in the last 3 or 4 years, we've been starting to do more work on grass and livestock systems. So again, with the DEFRA contract, we've been looking at how sward minerals change seasonally and differ across fields. That becomes important both for optimal use of pasture and for those of us who are starting to introduce grass leys into our arable rotations. If they can be used by livestock, we need to know how best to use those leys in terms of grazing or forage production. And understanding the sward minerals is an important part of that decision-making process. With drought in mind, deep-rooting grasses such as pasteloliums have been developed, but we've been interested to see to what extent these might have some benefits in terms of carbon sequestration and water infiltration. We know that if managed appropriately, grass leys can improve infiltration and at catchment scale help to reduce flood risk, but we want to find out more about what the potential of these modern deep-rooting agricultural grass cultivars is. Taking that a stage further, Phil showed us a photograph of Herbal Ley at Loddington. We're hosting some work with Sheffield University that's looking at how an even more diverse ley sward might have some benefits in terms of soil function and in terms of infiltration. And Phil referred to the to livestock and trees. What if we fed trees to livestock? There's some evidence that willow, from some work that we've done, contains some of the minerals that are not available to ruminants in grass leys or pasture. So is the scope for feeding willow specifically to livestock on a small scale? We're trying to understand that before considering the wider practical implications. Looking at other things as well, such as intestinal worm controls. There's alleged to be some benefit in terms of that, but we're exploring that to see whether that's actually the case. Okay, Phil. And then moving on to the catchment management work that we've been doing and are continuing to do. Flood risk, we've mentioned that a few times. Obviously, very high on the public agenda just at the moment, and this is something that we've been looking at in our water-friendly farming project, which is a rigorous experimental design involving 3 headwater catchments, but in a very practical farm setting. So we have no direct control over these farms, but with the farmers, we're putting in place measures that will have some benefits in terms of flood risk management. And you can see at the top right there an example of one of our permeable dams, which has no impact on the adjacent land, on the productive land, but can help to slow the flow and hold back water at peak flow. So that's one approach to climate change implications. Another one, particularly for biodiversity, is drought conditions in summer. I mean, higher nutrient concentrations in water. And one approach to that is to identify very small catchments in the landscape which aren't affected by agricultural runoff or indeed by domestic sources of pollution, which is another area that we've been exploring in detail, and creating very small clean water ponds within those. And we've been able to demonstrate that over a 5-year period, they've had a substantial increase, resulted in a substantial increase in aquatic plant diversity at the landscape scale. And nutrients and pesticides, we've been looking at those as well, in particular looking at trying to tease out the agricultural and domestic sources of nutrients, phosphorus in particular, such as sewage treatment works and septic tanks. Okay, Phil. So it's not just farmers, of course. That illustrates the point. Septic tanks, sewage treatment works. There are a lot of rural residents in agricultural landscapes and agricultural catchments. So we feel it's important to work with them, often there's, even in a rural community, there's a very poor understanding of agriculture and the issues that we face as farmers, let alone the environmental issues that we're trying to address. And so we led a project a few years ago that involved engaging the local community in learning together about our local landscape. And that book, Exploring a Productive Landscape, is available from the GWCT shop, should you wish to buy a copy. Okay, Phil. And that leads us on to the wider community, really. Working very much with the local community, not just the farmers. Open Farm Sunday, we contribute to that most years. We've got a small orchard which was designed and is planted and managed by the local community. I mentioned the small shoot we have on the farm. Again, that's another way of engaging with the local community, and so we're engaging with different aspects of the local community in different ways. And then finally, 2 points that I'd like to make in terms of the community. Of course, the sort of research that I'm talking about, I've been talking about in these last few slides, and it is only a very brief overview. I hope you've got a taste of the range of topics that we're researching. We can only do that through collaboration with other researchers, whether it's universities or other research institutes. And so that's a really important community that we're engaged with. And then we're actively involved with members of the farming community. This webinar is one means of achieving that. And we'd really welcome your feedback and your thoughts on what we're doing to help guide what we do in future. Back to you, Phil.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Chris. So we're just on the home run now, so a few slides to finish off on. But you can see from Chris's talk there, from farmland ecology, agri-environment, density of wild bird cover, soil management, biology, the list is endless, farmers' participation, catchment and community involvement. I often find that there's always a researcher out with a penetrometer or a gas met machine. They never ever get under my feet or in the way of the tractors, obviously, Chris, but there's always someone counting nests in a hedge somewhere, gathering data with really practical applied science as well. Stuff that really means something to farm. An audience that, practical working folk who want to get to the nitty gritty of what's going on. And even some of Chris's, or some of the experience with sheep, even some of the sheep stayed in the field as well, which was quite good for some of my crops. And I must just mention community. We have a great relationship with our local WI, who are a great resource for us when we're putting on events with the catering. I've also been told to say that by my wife, who's the president as well. So hopefully that's gone down well. And I'll get some tea when I get home, hopefully. Right, so moving on. So what about the future? So the final few slides, and thanks very much for that, Chris. So the future, we all know that coming around the corner is the language of government and the future of what are we going to do? Are we going to have a grassland-based system, or is it going to be more lower input system? There's even talk of landscape change. And how are we going to still produce food for an ever-growing world population? And how are we going to do this without exporting problems to other parts of the planet? And we're well in a position here with a rich history of agri-environment schemes. So we know there's a transition from BPS and greening through countryside stewardship into this new environmental land management. And I think we're also going to have to look at how the marketplace helps us, how we can get more productive, because the more productive and efficient we get, the better we can get for our environment. And then there'll be some support for environmental land management as well. So these are all going to key into what's going to be the opportunities for us in the future. Can we make this more regenerative system work for us profitably, as well as restoring and enhancing and improving our environment? So if we look at some of the other things for the future, there's a lot, and crop tech in the future, so the East of England Showground and in the previous years has looked at technology based around farm machinery and how we're going to feed people with new ways of being more efficient. And I might just say that we're going to bring in our own efficiency here. So here I brought the drone in today. So we'll be using drone in some of our own farm trials with our Kellogg's Origins growings and our Syngenta project. But we'll be looking at mapping environmental habitats with this as well. So looking at how we can use this for wildlife enhancement as well and map this. And then perhaps we'll be using it for some of our monitoring and metrics in the future. So I'll put that away before the pilot comes in. Right. So yeah, I'll put it away safely, Ollie. So there we go. So just a final few things as well about business and planning for the future as well. You know, with all the talk about what's going to go on with Brexit and trade and you know, prices, et cetera, there are a number of things we can do to plan for our own businesses that we're in control of. So I would recommend the AHDB Horizon document about preparing for change. Look at what top performing businesses are doing. And if you look at the slide on the right there, and I'll hold it up, the demo here for our integrated farm management wheel, all these things on this list are things that you have control of today. So I would say if you're starting about business evaluation, look very much at those, because whatever happens in the future, you have a lot of control over those. And then the final one, the reason I put our logo up there, you know, if you want to come and talk to us or you want to come and discuss some of these issues, we're always there, and I'll have some contact details at the end. Yes, so I talked about investing in people, and Chris talked about community. People make these things happen. So, you know, gaining more knowledge and often sharing knowledge between people. So it's not only us just giving knowledge out, we're gaining a lot from other people as well. People are talking to each other. It's very interactive. So investing in people is really important. And I hope you'll forgive me, Alison and James, for just a little bit of an advert here as well. But on-farm training, one of the things that we're doing at Allerton Project is the Basis Beta Conservation Management course, which covers the wider farm environment. It covers soil and water. And that is a basis qualification that we've been doing here. And we've probably put several hundred, if not, yeah, probably 300 to 400 people have been through that Beta Conservation Management course. And this is exactly where environmental land management goes in the future. It's one of those courses which is well established and will be the sort of thing that if you're advising on environmental schemes in the future is really a must to upskill ourselves there. So we'd be delighted to see you. And that leads me to really some of the stuff, Alison, we've been talking about, which is some of our online courses, which hopefully by the end of the month, our first one on regenerative agriculture with the East of England Showground will go live. So it'll be a 2-hour course. It'll be talking about a lot of the things we've talked about, you know, that conservation agriculture plus livestock and that mindset change. And you can see the other ones, we'll have a series of them, and hopefully, not putting too much pressure on me, but for September, October and November, another one will come online, specifically about IPM and pollinators, clean water, air, healthy soils, and agri-environment systems for the future. So I'm delighted that we've been able to form this partnership with East of England to help us and support us there. And we'll be helping as well with things like crop tech. We'd be delighted to come in and help you there. So that's great news. So thank you very much to Charlie and to Alison there. So if I just finish off with a couple of, so if I just say that we've taken you through a farming story, a research story on farmland, cover cropping. We didn't really talk too much about woods, fuels and renewables, but we talked about green cover, we talked about wild bird cover, we talked about soil research and water. We didn't talk too much about the shoot. Perhaps that we do a course on game and wildlife management, which is another basis accredited course, and of course farmland birds. So I hope that whistle-stop tour around Loddington and the work we've done for the last 25 years has engaged with you, has enthused you, has informed you. Our details are there with our website, so details about how you get onto courses. Our phone number's there for the office, our Twitter feed's there, and Alison, I think that's it.
Okay.